I believe from talking with Mr. Sobers that this project had come before you perhaps a few weeks ago, so you understand the background and why this environmental site assessment was completed. So I won't go into the history of that unless you had some specific questions related to that. Essentially, going back to the 1970s is when previous environmental site assessments of this property took place. Historically, this site operated as a foundry. Hanchett Manufacturing later moved in. The studies that were done in the 1970s revealed that there was a considerable amount of contamination on this site. A lot of that was related to underground storage tanks that contained various petroleum products, as well as the operations that occurred within the building. As of the 1990s, we retrieved additional documents from the DEQ where they had updated their studies on the contamination and conditions of the soil and groundwater on this site. And by the 1990s, what the DEQ was seeing is that actually the concentrations of contaminants were being reduced through what you might call natural biodegradation. Okay? In addition to that, the underground storage tanks that had leaked on the property had been removed. The soil contamination around those previous tanks had been removed. So quite a bit of remediation had already taken place by the 1990s. Some other studies had been completed after that related to some off-site issues. I believe there's a gas station formerly located here. There were some groundwater studies that were done to see if plumes from this gas station site had migrated onto the Hanchett property. What we had found at the end of our recent environmental evaluation is that the major source areas of contamination are no longer present on this site. We did a very thorough evaluation which consisted of several soil borings, a lot of soil samples, and several groundwater samples that were collected throughout this entire property. And in the end, what we essentially came up with were what you might call a few isolated areas of interest, okay? The three circles that you see here in blue represent some isolated areas where you have some minimal soil contamination, okay? There's residual heavy metals and some other chemicals that were probably used at the time that Hanchett was actually doing their manufacturing in the building. The size of these sample locations is basically a 2-inch diameter hole. Okay, so the areas that were sampled around these hot spots were clean. Okay, this red area up in the corner, there was some staining on the concrete that we sampled, and historically this area is where they had electrical transformers. Okay. So at some point in time, those transformers had leaked a little bit onto the concrete. We sampled the concrete. There is a little bit of contamination on the surface of the concrete. Overall, I can tell you, again, if you look back in history compared to the original levels of contamination out here to what's here today, it's extremely minimal. Moving forward, as I understand it, with the road improvements and the improvements or reconstruction essentially of the bridge, most of this contamination in these isolated areas will either not need to be disturbed, or that material can be placed under the new street and whatever work is being done along North State Street here. I'll stop right there because I know that was a lot of information. So if you have some questions about that part of it, I'm happy to answer it.
But what you just commented on, the sites that show some contamination could find their way under a new street as designed. Is that part of the remediation approach? I mean, would that be considered remediation if they were incorporated under a street as opposed to being left open and subject to being built on?
It could be considered remediation. We typically think of it as a way to not only protect the health and welfare of the public or users of the site, but also a smart engineering practice. Why pay to have this material excavated and transported to a landfill when it may be extremely suitable to use as backfill when you're putting in a new road? That's a typical practice that we recommend, and it's been very successful.
But you identify another option, which would be to excavate,
Sure.
remove, it's taken to an authorized site,
Right.
and in that way, the contaminant is remediated.
Correct.
Okay. Go ahead.
What more would you like to know?
Well, I didn't know if you
If you were putting a
wanted
dollar
to-
figure to that, are we talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions? What kind of a number would we look at?
Well, best case, okay, from my perspective, best case is that, again, as I understand the project, this building will be demolished. East Pier Marquette Street will be relocated and essentially be somewhere along this vicinity. And it's also my understanding that there will be some earthwork along North State Street. Best case is that the material that's located in these areas will be replaced underneath pavements or underneath topsoil, which may ultimately be landscaped for some purpose. That's best case. If the option is sought after to actually remove the soil, which is not necessary, but if there's some reason that needs to happen, whether it's a comfort level or something along those lines, we did some estimates on, just these small isolated areas, and, basically came up with anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 to excavate, transport, and place that soil in a licensed disposal facility. So we're not talking about $1 million kind of remediation project that you'll have on your hands.
In his position paper to us, Mr. Sobers mentioned something that I don't know that you or others at SME would articulate, but according to his position paper, with complete confidence, the SME engineers advised that the site was well worth the purchase and redevelopment into a more appropriate use along the Muskegon River. You've acknowledged $50,000 from the County Brownfield Authority. In the purchase agreement that we have for the property, closing events are triggered by accepting the Phase 1 and Phase 2 studies. After you, we're going to hear from our engineers on a proposal for the industrial park infrastructure project, which has increased the cost of design engineering to over $244,000, and construction engineering upwards of $736,000, and at least in part because the proposed project includes a demolition of the Hanchett building. And beginning, I think, tomorrow, we'll be opening bids submitted to our city treasurer following requests for proposals to enter into an installment purchase contract for $550,000. There's a lot of skin in the game. If it was your skin, would you get in this game? I'll put it another way. Is there anything that you've seen that would talk us out of this as something we should not enter into based on the Phase 1 and Phase 2 reports? Anything that you see that can't be remediated, can't be dealt with in an appropriate, reasonable, cost-effective way? Because there's a lot at stake here for those reasons I've articulated.
Absolutely. I understand that. From an environmental perspective, I would say no. I see no issues with that.
As Paul has pointed out, the original agreement that we had with Fleis and VandenBrink was for $129,000. That was basically the planning and design services for the bridge as bridge only. Once we got involved in the, well, let me also say that if we were doing the bridge alone with MDOT funds, the city would have been on the hook for about $1.5 million of the construction of this bridge in planning and engineering services. And the bridge as a total was in the range of just a fraction over $3 million. When the EDA got involved, not only were we doing the bridge, but we're doing more extensive storm sewer work as a result of some of the recent flooding that went through Wolverine Worldwide and created some problems with them. It does involve the purchase of Hanchett's, and it involves sinking the water line a little deeper at the Maple Street Bridge area, which is now exposed. You can actually look over the bridge and see our water line in the water, and we'll take care of that. So the project has gone from a $3 million to a $5.2 million project as a whole, which obviously then includes more work on the part of the engineers for these ancillary projects. So their engineering cost elevates to the $244,100 number that you see on the board behind me. The odd way we've worded this is that the attached proposal details that the change also includes the cost of construction engineering for a total of $736,300. The construction engineering portion is a $492,000 figure. The total engineering project number is the $736,000. It probably would have been a little clearer if we had said includes the cost of construction engineering of $492,000 for a total amount of $736,000 as the total engineering number that's being committed overall. So I would point that out there. Construction engineering is not $736,000, it's $492,000. So with that background, we have a much bigger project, and the overall obligation of the city really relates, from the construction point of view, the acquisition of Hanchett's. The EDA is covering the engineering costs, which MDOT would not. We will have separately some construction of the walkway underneath the bridge to tie Riverwalk together, and we will have some water line costs on the boring of the river. But overall, our project obligation has dropped with the EDA coming on board.
No question there's an increase in cost, but this project has gone from a facelift for the Baldwin Street Bridge to an extreme makeover at that intersection, which includes not only the bridge, which when it's done will have 5-foot wide sidewalks, the storm sewer improvements, improvements to Catherine Street, existing water main improvements. We've talked about the Hanchett property, and I don't know how we can take on all of that without, the costs that increase as a result of it. So, but as I said, it's an extreme makeover, but I think it'll be one that will be an attractive one as well. All right, we'll vote on this.
Rothstein?
Yes.
Warbeck?
Yes.
Anderson?
Yes.
Hoganson?
Yes.
James?
Yes.